Good morning and welcome to the 37th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. Apologies have been received from committee members Alison Harris and Andy Whiteman. Graham Simpson is attending on Alison's behalf. I would welcome Alex Rowley as a new member of the committee and also take the opportunity to thank his predecessor, Rhoda Grant, for her contributions to the committee's work. I'm just wondering, does Alex Rowley have any interest to declare, or has he already done that? Right, I think he's already done that, so unless Alex Rowley, if you want to come in.
Yeah, I would just simply refer to my register, the interests convener.
And item 1 on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are we agreed? We're agreed. And we now turn to item 2 on the agenda, which is the consideration of BIFAB, the offshore wind sector and the Scottish supply chain. So I would welcome our first panel of witnesses for this session who are joining us remotely. They are Jason Fudge, the President of DF Barnes, Sean Power, Vice President of DF Barnes, and Hazel Nolan, who's the organiser for GMB Scotland. And I'd particularly like to thank Sean and Jason, who are joining us from Canada at what is a fairly early stage in the day. So thank you. Now, just to say that our broadcasting colleagues here will control your microphones and cameras, so if you allow a few seconds after a question is posed to speak, just so that we hear everything that you have to say, please. If witnesses want to come in, then it'd be helpful if you could just type an R in the chat box on your screen, and you can also raise your hand, but preferably if you can type R in the chat box, and that will be picked up by the clerk so that I can know to bring you into the discussion. So if I might start with a general question to our witnesses. After the recent announcements, what is your view on the future for the offshore supply chain for offshore wind? Sorry, what is the supply chain for offshore wind developments in Scotland and for Scotland and Scottish business? Don't know who would like to come in there first. Sean Power, did you nod indicating you'd like to come in?
No, I think Jason was coming in. I'm sorry.
All right, Jason.
Yes, good morning, convener. I think from our perspective, we can speak certainly for the fabrication aspect of foundation work, in particular for the renewable sector. And obviously, we're quite concerned. The state aid limitations and the market conditions in the UK offshore wind sector are quite challenging for the domestic supply chain. We've had this discussion numerous times with various officials from government. And in our opinion, is one of the primary reasons why BIFAB has had quite a challenging time in the last number of years, in particular with the renewable sector.
All right. If neither of our other witnesses want to come in, I'll move on to get into the discussion with other committee members. And I should say we're, I think, down for approximately an hour for this session. Sorry, Claire. I don't know, is Hazel Nolan want to come in? Hazel Nolan.
Apologies. I think it needs to be pointed out that in Scotland, almost every offshore wind turbine has been built by a state aid-backed company. And I think that is extremely important because at the moment, BIFAB facing potential collapse, there's no realistic prospect of a domestic supply chain in Scottish offshore wind, despite Scotland being the world leader when it comes to offshore wind. We've just had 2 projects of amounting to over £7 billion, and not one job in manufacturing is going to be brought to Scottish Shores as a result.
All right, we may be having slight difficulties with the technical side of things here. I think apart from myself and 2 committee members and the clerks, we're all online remotely, as it were. So we'll just have to work with the system. At this stage, I would like to bring in Richard Lyle, who joins us remotely. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. My question is to Jason Fudge. What investment or financial guarantees did you make in your business plan when you took over BiFab, and have you met all those commitments? And would you be willing to share that business plan publicly with the committee? And if I can also ask, how much has DF Barnes invested in BiFab since its acquisition of the firm in 2008? What has that money bought, and what has it achieved? To Jason.
So thanks for that question, Richard. Certainly, you know, our business plan was set out in great detail and was provided to government late in 2017 into early 2018. As part of that business plan, we set out what our vision was for BiFab and how we would, implement that business plan in conjunction with the other shareholder being the Scottish ministers. It was always the intent of that business plan that Scottish ministers would be the primary financier of the business. So, you know, the business plan set out the money that was required as part of the revitalization of BiFab, and that money was coming from Scottish ministers. That was agreed between the parties. There was also quite a lot of discussion around the investment that may be required in the yards in Fife and Lewis. And those yards primarily are government-owned yards, in particular the yard in Methil and of course the yard in Lewis. So we decided and was set on our business plan that we would convene a infrastructure working group. That infrastructure working group began in 2018. It met numerous times and included, folks from BiFab, from ourselves here in Canada, DF Barnes and JB Driver, from government and from local government in Fife as well. And that committee met and agreed on primary infrastructure works that was going to happen, in particular at the Methil Yard, and concreting happened there. That investment was agreed to be paid by JB Driver, as was done in previous agreements with BiFab, as part of increase in rents for the yard. I will say that the infrastructure investment is not the primary purpose why BiFab has struggled, and that was set out in our business plan. The primary reason that BiFab has had a challenging time with the renewable sector is primarily driven, as Hazel referred to earlier, by open market competition, state aid legislation, and the fact that we have an ever increasing scope of competition, from many cases, state-financed enterprise. We ran into this situation many times with other entities in Europe, and now in particular with firms from the Middle East and Asia. So understanding the market dynamics that BiFab has to compete against, there is no level of investment that could overcome that. What needs to happen, in our view, is that there are supply chain plans that are agreed to by developers and therefore guarantee a minimum amount of work that would happen in the Scottish supply chain. That is what happens in most jurisdictions in which we operate. And that is what we view is a key success factor for the supply chain for renewable sector in Scotland.
Yeah, this was a question I posed last week, Jason. If we can't get a contract because the price is too high, because we can get it from East Asia or wherever, you know, how are we going to win contracts? How can the government or you ensure that work goes to BIFAB? And I'm sorry if I stray into anyone else's question.
I think it has to be supply chain agreements. I mean, these are the basis of major energy infrastructure work here in Canada. We see it in the United States. We see it in contracts we're executing for infrastructure in Africa. These all jurisdictions, in large part, have local supply chain protection. And if you look at a project that is a land-based project, for instance, that may be an energy infrastructure project in the UK, by virtue of the type of work and the location of the work, then the work largely gets completed in the UK. So that type of work requires less supply chain protection than a marine-based project where work can be brought in from elsewhere. And when we first looked at acquiring BIFAB as a going concern in 2017, generally the scope of BIFAB's competition at that time was from the UK and we'll say Northern Europe. As time progressed into 2018, the scope of that competition increased to include all of continental Europe. Then it increased and expanded in scope to include the Middle East. And as time went on, now it includes, effectively the entire globe, in particular Asia. So the vast majority, if not all, of the current foundation work that's ongoing for offshore UK renewables projects is happening in the Middle East and Asia, which are the lowest cost economies based on labor, state aid, funding, economies of scale, all of those reasons. And there is virtually nothing that the UK supply chain can do to compete with those companies on price other than supply chain protections for the industry. And from our perspective, we were never expecting that 100% of the work would be done in the UK. We know that UK doesn't have the capacity to do 100% of the work as it relates to foundations in particular, but a reasonable amount of that work could have been executed in the UK had there been the appropriate agreements with developers, in our view.
Moving on to a second question, but last week it was suggested that we don't have the facilities in Scotland. Anyway, why did DF Barnes of the opinion that the Scottish Government should provide the financial guarantee for the NNG project? What prevents DF Barnes or its parent company, JV Driver, from providing that guarantee? Or are you suggesting it should only be government that should provide this guarantee?
So, when we took over the business in 2018, the first thing we did was add BIFAB to our global bonding facility, and that was not easy. I was involved in that process. That process took many months, and BIFAB, in its challenged financial and commercial situation, was effectively an unbondable business. So we worked very closely with the management of BIFAB and very closely with our own bonding provider, and managed to get BIFAB onto our global bonding facility. And we provided the first assurance and guarantees for the project for 150 pin piles from Moray East, which was largely executed in Lewis. Sometime after that project, or towards the end of that project, based on an annual review, which happens by our bonding agency, they reviewed the commercial situation of BIFAB and the market conditions and whatnot, and the contractual forms that are utilized in that in the industry, in the offshore renewables industry, and determined that the risk profile associated with that was beyond the scope of what the bonding agency could sustain, and therefore 100% cash security was required for all future bonding. And we set that out in a statement that we made last week. We brought this to the attention of government because it was not that was not part of our plan. That was something that happened unexpectedly, and we wanted to work together to solution so that BIFAB would not be precluded from future works, in particular because we were negotiating the NNG contract at that time. So we discussed it with government. Government discussed it with its own advisors, and it was determined that government could provide the bond and the guarantee for the NNG project. That was put in front of Finance Committee at sometime late in 2019. and was conditionally approved based on the award of the contract.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you, convener.
A brief supplementary from Graham Simpson.
Thanks, convener. Jason, hello, and I really appreciate you either staying up late or getting up very early, because I realise what the time difference is. I'm not sure I heard an answer to Richard Lyle's question of how much DF Barnes has invested in BiFab since it was acquired in 2018. Did he give that answer? I didn't hear it.
I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what we invested in terms of financial dollars, but I can tell you that we invested a huge amount of our time, a huge amount of our resources here in terms of our people in Eastern Canada. In particular, myself and Sean, who are both on this committee session today, we spent over 50% of our time involving ourselves with the management team at BiFab, supporting them, actively pursuing bids. We had our project management team that came from Canada to support the Pin Piles project. We invested in training, we invested in the bonding facility, and we worked very closely with the Infrastructure Working Committee to make sure that there was appropriate level of investment into the yards to be successful. And I will say that in all of the pursuits that we made, in particular in the offshore wind sector, since our acquisition of the business, partial acquisition of the business alongside Scottish Government since 2018, none of our pursuits were ever, not awarded because of lack of infrastructure or investment in BiFab. They were always, lost due to cost competition from foreign fabricators.
Jason, you must know how much money you've invested in the company. You must have an idea. Jason or Sean, one of you must know that figure. What is it?
Sean Power.
Yeah, I can probably come in here. On this whole topic of investment, you will probably remember that when we began looking at the acquisition of BiFab, BiFab was a going concern. It was going through a project called Beecher's Project. And just before we were able to acquire the company, the Beecher's Project got in some trouble. The company then got in some significant trouble, and all the cash was depleted. There was were it not for government support at the time, the company certainly would have closed and gone into administration. And it was in that atmosphere then that we came in, and Scottish Government invited us in to take a look at operating the company and restoring it over a period of time. So we agreed to do that. The company was not an investable company at the time because it had just lost all of its money, and it had just lost a significant or had significant trouble with execution of a contract. But we thought there was a lot of promise in both the management and workers of the company, as well as and we wanted to do business in Scotland. So we came in but in terms of investment, it was not a company that you would, after that kind of significant loss and near catastrophe, put millions of pounds in. That wouldn't have made sense. So we went in the discussions with the government at the time. It was always understood that we would come in and try to restore the company, but we wouldn't be providing a lot of cash, and that would be, and the Scottish Government agreed to that, understood that, and thought that they would be the primary financiers, as Jason said.
Well, that's fine, but we know how much money the government's put in. That's 37 million. In fact, it's probably more than that. Neither of you have answered the question. How much money have you put in?
You have to remember that of the 37 million, by far the lion's share of that went to saving the company from the Beecher's Project.
So I think we're not going to get an answer
All
to
37
that
million
question.
of the money that Sean just referred to was put into the business to save the Beatrice contract. There was a further working capital facility that was provided by government that was provided after we acquired the business. The 37 million dealt with a pre-existing issue that was before our ownership of the business. And in fact, that level of investment was much smaller than what was required by the business and was set out in our business plan.
Alec Rowley. I'm obviously not going to get a figure out of them, convener.
Yeah, I think what was wanted was the figure invested, not by the government, which we know, but as Mr. Simpson asked. So I'll bring in Alex Rowley before we move to questions from Colin Beattie.
Thanks, convener. Just picking up on those points. I mean, I know the statement from BIFAB last week said that the final purchase discussions and agreements always envisaged that the Scottish Government would be the primary financer of the business as it recovered from the Beatrice project, where the £37 million went to. It also states that today the Scottish Government provided less than 50% of the working capital. But my question there would be, what changed if at the time of the discussions for the final purchase there was a recognition in government? What actually changed? I know that the government minister that dealt with that at the time was the finance secretary, and that obviously changed, as well as the government department seemed to shift from under finance into a different part of government. But in your opinion, what changed if you had that agreement then and it seemed clear that the government understood that it needed to invest? And indeed, the other question of that would be in late 19, when the government was prepared to put up the bond and went to the Finance Committee to do so, what changed? That's the question I think that the workforce are asking.
No, that's a great question, and it's not a question that we have all the answers to, unfortunately. It's a question certainly for government officials and government ministers. In our view, and what the general kind of communication line has been, is that there were state aid challenges in terms of providing additional financing in a compliant way. And this was an ongoing discussion that we've had with government for years. It was identified pre-acquisition. It was discussed during the acquisition process to make sure that all financing was state aid compliant. And we recognized it as being a challenge for the business, not only from a financing point of view, but from the competitive point of view, as it related to EU open market rules, because we view them to be akin to each other. State aid in terms of investment into the business, but also challenges associated with state, kind of state-led supply chain preference policies. So it made it a very challenging situation for BIFAB throughout the term of our ownership. What changed in 2020? It became evident to Scottish Government ministers, which we've had no feedback on, that it could not provide additional financing for BIFAB in September of 2020, as it would not be deemed state aid compliant. And we were shocked by that decision, because we had just signed a letter of intent to enter into a contract with SIPEM for the NNG contract that was going to put 400 to 500 people back to work in Fife. So, that contract had been negotiated for quite some time. It was delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in the face of a pandemic and in the face of a major infrastructure project that was going to put a bunch of people back to work, the financing was withdrawn, and the assurance and guarantees were withdrawn, and we were shocked.
And could I follow that up, convener?
Yes, please do.
I read the legal opinion that the GMB union got on this, and that certainly seems to contradict what the government says is their legal opinion. But has the company been involved in any of the discussions around the legal opinion? Has the trade union been involved in any of those discussions? And has either the company or the trade union been involved in discussions with both governments and the working group?
So we have provided information, of course, to Scottish Government and to their advisors, on state aid matters. We were not involved with the BIFAB working group, and which was particularly frustrating for us because, the management and directors of BIFAB, certainly alongside of our partners, union partners, were instrumental in facilitating the BIFAB working group. So we haven't had as much involvement. We don't understand all of the ins and outs of state aid compliancy because it was always a matter for government officials. We brought up numerous options and discussion points that we thought were relevant, in particular as related to the NNG contract. EU state aid compliancy and open market, the open market economics, at least in our view, the intent of that is to ensure that there's fair competition between all member states of the EU. In this particular case, for the NNG contract, we weren't even competing against other fabricators in the EU. All of our competition was foreign. And therefore, we provided our opinion on the matter that, not being experts on state aid compliancy, but how can state aid compliancy apply in a situation where we're not even competing against other firms in Europe? However, that didn't seem to impact the view of advisors and government officials, and unfortunately, their decision related to state aid compliancy has not changed.
And was the GMB involved, could I ask?
I would say, at least in my opinion, in a very limited capacity, if at all. Hazel, maybe you can answer that question better.
No, I would agree with that assessment. We've had limited communication. In fact, that's been one of the issues that we've had in regards to this whole process. The question we would ask, though, based on the legal advice which we have submitted to the committee for the purposes of this morning's session, is our understanding is that the guarantee was made clear that this was from the Scottish Government in September 2019. So why did it take so long, and why did the Scottish Government only pull it at the very last minute? And what evidence is there that they did test the market to be able to rely on the advice that it was going to be in breach of state aid regulations? And why won't the Scottish Government release this information? It should be subject to a judicial review, which obviously this committee is not in a position to call for itself. But we would be calling for, and we would like the committee to call for the release of that legal advice.
May I just clarify, Hazel?
Hazel
Nolan.
I can add to that statement, if convener, if you don't mind, is that
briefly,
part of the reason why there was there was issues of state aid compliancy was in fact the matter of time. So there was state aid compliant in late 2019. It was state aid compliant in early 2020. For reasons obviously beyond the control of the business and impacting many businesses in the wider UK and in particular in Scotland, is the COVID-19 pandemic. That is what pushed out the ultimate award and commencement of the project. And during that time, when there was such a negative impact to employment globally, and there was an opportunity to put 500 people back to work, that was the time at which it moved from government's view to be compliant to non-compliant. And during that time, we also had an RFP with another offshore wind project, Seagreen, where the scope of our competition was entirely Asian. BIFAB was not successful purely from a price perspective on that project, and that also, because of the matter of time, also had a negative impact on state aid view.
Just to go quickly back to Hazel Nolan before we come to questions from Colin Beattie. You said you were calling for a judicial review. Surely that's something you may decide to bring to the courts or not. It's obviously not a matter for this committee to initiate judicial reviews. Can you clarify what you meant by that?
Well, the only way that we would be able to get the information is through a judicial review. I did stipulate that is beyond the remit of this committee. A committee cannot call a judicial review on its own body. So
something the GMB.
yes, we obviously would.
So it's something the GMB can do, though, initiate and start a judicial review, is it not?
Potentially, but what we've been told by Minister Fiona Hislop is that the only way that we will be given the legal advice that was provided to the Scottish Government would be if there were to be a judicial review. That's what the Scottish Government Minister has told us.
And I think yes, and I think the advice you've received, which you've shared with the committee, indicates that advice proceeds partially on incomplete information due to unwillingness of the Scottish Government to reveal the advice it has received.
That is correct.
Right, we'll come on to questions from Colin Beattie now.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to pursue one or two angles still on the question of this guarantee business. Just to clarify, is it DF Byrne's view at the moment that BIFAB could get a financial guarantee to cover the NNG contract from the private sector? Do you think they could get that? Is it a question of price for that particular bond, or is it completely impossible?
It would be extremely challenging for BIFAB to get that assurance and bonding on its own merits.
So, again, coming back to the situation of DF Barnes and JV Driver, which you said went through a challenging period in terms of their ability to get bonding, why are you not providing that guarantee?
So we addressed this issue in a statement that we made last week. So it's not, and just to clarify, it's not an issue for us to get bonding or provide guarantees. The company has the ability to do that. We can do it for companies within our business that qualify for the bonding and the guarantees that come through our bonding agency. So our bonding agency, upon review of BIFAB, had determined that the company was effectively unbondable and it would require 100% cash security for any future bonds and guarantees. And just so the committee is aware, these are large sums of money that are required as part of offshore wind contracts to provide assurance that the work is going to proceed as planned. And the term of these warranty bonds and performance bonds are quite long. We attempted to negotiate the terms of these bonds and guarantees to the lowest common denominator, but you are competing against large state-led firms from outside of Europe that can obviously have very, very significant resources. So if another fabricator is prepared to provide the bond, then it ensures that BIFAB is also going to have to provide the bond. So, these amounts are very large. You're talking millions and millions and millions of pounds that would need to be cash secured and outstanding for up to 7 years. So this is the scope of what you're talking about from a bonding and guarantee point of view.
So you're saying that the term of these bonds can be 7 years?
Yes.
Mm.
They go through, the term of the bonds typically, just for clarity, is the actual duration of the execution of the work, which typically on these contracts can run from 18 to 24 months. And then for a minimum of, in many cases, a minimum of 5 years for a warranty period.
Are you aware of any other governments in Europe that are providing financial guarantees to companies in the offshore wind supply chain?
we can't say for certain. Certainly, we wouldn't have insight into, into these businesses and how the assurances and guarantees were provided. But one example we would bring to the attention of the committee is a state-led fabricator and kind of ship repair business in Spain that we competed against on numerous occasions, which is state financed and state owned in Spain. And we were uncompetitive against that business based on the pricing that it could offer, based on the state-led business and the assurance package it could offer. This in particular, one pursuit that was quite frustrating for us as shareholders of BIFAB and for BIFAB management team was the Kincardine offshore wind project. And if anyone has read the consenting documents associated with Kincardine, it was set out in those documents that 100% of the fabrication was going to happen in Scotland. And in fact, 100% of the fabrication for that project happened in Spain. And this brings back the challenge that we've identified in terms of making sure that there are supply chain plans that are enforceable and can protect the Scottish supply chain. In our view, 100% of that work, based on a commitment from the developer, should have been done in Scotland. And 100% of the work was done with a state-led business in Spain.
In previous evidence sessions, as I recall, we've had allegations that state aid isn't a level playing field across Europe. As a committee, we've obviously not investigated that with the remit of what we're doing now. However, do you have any comment on this level playing field on state aid across Europe?
Again, state aid compliance and rules are not certainly our area of expertise. I would say, though, just based on my opinion of being, involved in this industry, and in particular, kind of BIFAB scope of competition over the last 2.5 years, that I think it's worth investigating how all of the countries of the EU manage state aid compliancy. Certainly, we can't say that any one country or business is not complying with state aid, but in our view, it was particularly challenging for us operating in Scotland, and it seemed to be less challenging for other businesses operating in other parts of the EU.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. Earlier in the session, it was mentioned that the £37.4 million Scottish Government investment, which included equity and loan facilities, was purely to save the Beatrice contract. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, whether the Scottish Government knew that investment was not about securing further contracts necessarily, but just about saving the Beatrice contract, how many jobs that was associated with. I'd just like to hear a bit more information on that point, please. Sean,
yes, so the entirety of the 37 million that you're referring to was invested into BIFAB to complete the Beatrice contract. And, ourselves and government are fully aware of that amount. And that amount was actually what was converted at the time of our acquisition, and a small additional amount shortly thereafter into government's equity position in BIFAB.
And how?
So yes, it's quite clear that amount was 100% specific to the closeout of the Beatrice contract.
And how many jobs was that investment associated with in terms of completing the Beatrice contract, Jason?
Oh, that takes us back about 3 years, but it would be in order of magnitude. There would have been about 1,000 people working on that project to close it out. I can't say specific, but that's, Sean, is that kind of your recollection of that as well?
Yeah, yes, it is. Between 1,000 and 1,200 people.
Thanks for that. And since that contract, did the Scottish Government, and do you have any communications in relation to that, invest that amount on the presumption that you would be successful in perhaps winning new contracts that would, that have since transpired? Was there any discussions around that?
Well, that initial money was purely to close out Beatrice, so it did not. It was helpful in the sense that obviously it kept BIFAB as a going concern, but ultimately was consumed entirely by completing that project. So it didn't provide any access to capital for future projects and future pursuits.
Okay. And similarly, was the separate loan facility of £15 million after the DF Barnes acquisition, was that to help with ongoing work as well, or to help with cash flow?
Yes, that was what we referred to as a restructuring loan. So that was agreed, in early days prior to acquisition of our acquisition of BIFAB, and was intended to do what you just said, to restructure the business to help it in pursuits of contracts, and ultimately was also used to provide working capital for the execution of projects, including the Moray East pin pile project. We did a subsea infrastructure project for First E&P that was exported to Africa and was in part intended to finance ongoing works for the NNG projects as well.
Thanks, Jason. In terms of over the past few years, how has communication and support, not non-financial support, been received from the Scottish Government and its enterprise agencies? Have you been, have they been working closely with you? Have they kept that dialogue going? Is that something that has helped you continue or not?
Right from, and let's go back to even before we acquired the business and became a shareholder in BIFAB. Our relationship and our interaction with government was, in our view, incredibly strong. We happened to be working with the business on a going concern acquisition prior to the problems that were encountered on Beatrice, and then that translated into an ongoing dialogue with government as part of kind of supporting the business through that difficult time and restructuring the business for future pursuits. Our relationship was incredibly strong. What the government did to support the business at that time was significant, and it brought all of its agencies to bear in support of BIFAB and the UK, the Scottish supply chain. So, we had a very strong working relationship. There was a minister in place at the time, then the minister changed again. Derek Mackay became the minister responsible. We had a strong relationship with him and his team. We continued our pursuits. We were about to begin the energy contract. We kind of ran into the pandemic, which was obviously unexpected for everybody. And then during that time, I think it became, we couldn't travel to the UK. There was a lot of competing issues for government officials and Scottish ministers' attention. And I think in the last 6 months, we've had less interaction with government officials for those reasons. And it became very challenging for us to continue, to continue in our pursuits. And ultimately, in September, we were advised that, Scottish ministers would provide no further support to BIFAB, which was, as I said earlier, incredibly shocking for us. We had very little, if any, advance warning, and we were about to put 400 to 500 people back to work in Fife. And we had worked so hard on that contract. It was pretty disappointing.
Thanks, Jason. Just final question. Was the ongoing work, for example, with NNG, and we've heard from GMB Scotland, every wind turbine in Scotland has been built by a state aid-backed company. Was the contracts that you thought you could win predicated upon some form of state aid finance, e.g., you know, the Scottish Government and yourselves would have known the broad cost differentials between your competitors. So were you expecting some form of continuing support from the Scottish Government in order to continue operating at some form of similar levels as you had previously?
So, I mean, you know, up to the time of, September, we were expecting the government to support the business associated with the bonding guarantees and working capital facilities that have been previously agreed. So when that support was withdrawn, obviously put the business in a very challenging situation. You know, but you know, outside of that, we had an ongoing and recurring dialogue with government officials and government ministers regarding the competitiveness of the UK and Scottish supply chain without supply chain protections. And, the government was working with us, very closely with us, to improve market conditions in the offshore wind sector. And that was unfortunately happening much slower than we would have liked, and other businesses in the Scottish supply chain for offshore wind as well, at least in our view. The whole ScotWind initiative, which will put greater onus on making developers live by supply chain plans that they present as part of consenting, is a huge step forward. Unfortunately, with the support from BIFAB has been withdrawn at a critical juncture, prior to ScotWind, having a lasting and significant impact on future projects. So that is also quite disappointing for us.
Thank you, Jason.
A few brief questions from Alex Rowley, I think, before we move on to some other brief questions from Graham Simpson and then other committee members.
Can I pick up on this question about the supply chain and the fact that many nations have supply chain protections that limit the amount of international sourcing available to major energy infrastructure projects? No such legislation exists in Scotland or indeed the United Kingdom. Can I ask, has both the company and the GMB union made representations and suggestions to governments and why that's not happened? I think people in Scotland will be astonished to hear that the company that built the Kincardine or got the contract for Kincardine said that 100% of them would be fabricated in Scotland and 100% of them was done in Spain. So does that mean we need legislation, and does other European countries have legislation?
If I could just add into that, I think Jason Fudge has something to say, but I think Jason Fudge has already said the problem is there's no protection and there's no enforcement. So there's contractual conditions, as Mr. Rowley has just said, but these are not actually enforced. So I suppose there's two aspects to that. Is there a need for a change in the law, or is it a question of contracts just being enforced before the courts instead of just talking about it? The contracts are actually enforced by whoever has the power to do so, which presumably would be, in this context, the Scottish Government. Jason Fudge, do you want to come back? And then perhaps Hazel Nolan from the GMB's point of view.
Well, certainly we'll speak to it from BIFAB's point of view. I think the most significant change that can happen that will have a lasting and positive impact on the Scottish and UK supply chains as relates to many things, including the offshore wind sector, is that there are legislative changes to provide protection to Scottish-based and UK-based business. We operate many of our businesses operate in Canada, and we are doing work on large energy infrastructure projects, not offshore wind, but oil and gas, hydro, that sort of thing here, in particular in Canada. And all of our jurisdictions have supply chain protection. So when a developer or proponent comes forward and wants to develop an offshore oil and gas platform or a major hydro project, they negotiate with government, and government and the proponent agree on what percentage or components of the work are mandatory to be done in the local supply chain. And that is legislated in as part of the approval of the project. So therefore, the developer or the proponent can't not do that without paying massive penalties that would be in excess of what they would pay to get the work done at the local supply chain. And these protections are important. They are good for the local supply chain, and importantly good for the people who are ultimately going to be paying for the energy and the power that comes from these projects. And they help overcome major differences in the cost structure of business that operate in jurisdictions, in particular driven by the pay of people. So the pay of people that live in more developed nations like the UK and Scotland, like us here in Canada, are much higher than they are in other parts of the world that are less developed. And these protections ensure that are good, high-paying, skilled jobs that can do the work in a safe way with the highest level of quality and in geographic proximity to the projects, and with people and families that are going to pay for these projects based on paying for the power and other energy that's created from them, actually get the economic impact from these projects. So we are a huge supporter of local supply chain regulations, legislations, and plans. It's what we see in Canada, it's what we see in the United States, it's what we see in other jurisdictions, and we think it's important for the people and for businesses in Scotland too.
Hazel Nolan, if you wanted to make comment on this, perhaps.
Yes, I would. I mean, I know that most of this morning session has been focused on the ins and outs of the LNG project and Seagreen. However, you know, over 10 years ago, we were promised 130,000 jobs in the renewable sector by 2020. We have we've got a couple of thousand when it comes to construction, and the whole sector in the low carbon renewables economy is worth about 20,000 jobs. So we're over 100,000 jobs short of the predictions that we made. And this is not down to the intricacies of the contract regarding Seagreen. For example, you know, why were the yards not concreted years ago for that investment? And this comes down to a holistic lack of strategy at a UK and a Scottish government level. And I think that needs to be pointed out, because however disappointing losing out on Nertnagertha and Seagreen is, it's been a litany of contracts that we've been missing out on. And you look at other European countries such as France, for example, which has historically been over-reliant on nuclear, and they're quite late to the renewables industry for offshore wind. Yet they've made it quite clear that if you want to win contracts for producing offshore wind in France, you need to build that in France. You know, we discussed earlier the cost impact. There's also an environmental impact of putting all these offshore jackets on diesel ships and sailing them halfway across the world. And that needs to be taken into account just as much. And at the end of the day, we have a situation where Scotland has historically been a world leader in the production of offshore wind and a world loser in terms of generating jobs in this country.
Thank you. And two other quick questions, Convener. In the statement issued by BIFAB earlier this week, you state that, or it states that GV Driver, becoming aware of the growing state aid challenges of Scottish ministers, offered on numerous occasions to transfer some or all of its shares in BIFAB to Scottish ministers at no charge to the Scottish purse. I wonder what difference you believe that would have made if the ownership of the company had sat with the Scottish Government and if Scottish ministers had taken that offer up. And just quickly, can I ask, when you hear the Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop stand up in the Scottish Parliament and basically say that part of the reason behind this is the unwillingness of the parent company and major shareholder provide working capital. What is your thoughts on that?
Those are great questions, Alex. Certainly, you know, when it became evident to us that it was going to be challenging for our bonding agency to provide assurance for BIFAB, we sat with government and we solutioned around many ideas that could, replace that assurance and guarantee coverage that the agency had previously provided to the business. It was ultimately determined that the government could provide the guarantees on a state aid compliant basis, and that's what was agreed and put in front of Finance Committee late in 2019. So, you know, obviously that was what we considered to be the solution, and that was what we were intent, and what our view was that government was intent on doing right up until the time that obviously the support was withdrawn in September. With regards to the transfer of ownership of the business, as it became increasingly challenging based on the pandemic, obviously based on the fact that market conditions were in a distressed state, and we understood that would be considered as part of state aid compliancy. We solutioned with government again and said, look, the most important thing that can happen here is that the business survives and that we can continue, and you as a shareholder and obviously a major stakeholder beyond the scope of your interest in the business with the Scottish supply chain more generally, you know, if it makes sense for us to transfer the ownership at no cost to you, and that facilitates solutions for the business, then we're prepared to do that, because the most important thing is that the business continues to survive. Unfortunately, you know, that didn't happen. We can't speak to if it would improve or have no effect on state aid compliancy, because that was a matter for government officials and government advisors. But certainly we put that offer out there as a mechanism to ensure that no stone was left unturned in terms of the ability to find a solution for BIFAB and for the assurance for NNG.
Thank you.
Back to Graham Simpson for a few brief questions before we come to the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey. Graham Simpson.
Thanks again, Convener. Hazel Nolan, I just want to go back to this state aid issue and the legal advice that you've had. So reading through that advice, it seems, just tell me if you agree with this, it seems to be saying that actually the Scottish Government could have provided a guarantee, and even if it felt that it couldn't right now, it could have deferred this decision just a few weeks until 31st of December, when the EU state aid regime won't apply here. Would you agree with that, my analysis of that?
Yes, I would. I mentioned France in my earlier statement, and I asked the Minister at the time, when we had our last summit about renewables, what was the difference? And the response I was given between France and Scotland, for example. And I was told that the French just have more vociferous lawyers. And that's a really, really disappointing response to hear from the Scottish Government. I believe that this is ultimately down to political will. And, our legal advice that's been provided is obviously with the caveat that we don't have the legal advice that's provided to the Scottish Government, as I said. I need to make it clear again. But certainly, I would agree with the sentiment of that.
So you mentioned that Fiona Hislop had told you that in order to get the legal advice provided to the government, you would have to embark or take out a judicial review. How did she communicate that to you?
I held a meeting with members of the Scottish Trade Union Congress and Minister Hislop's office, and it was we asked formally for the legal advice, and the Minister said that the only way that advice would be released would be under judicial review. This
was an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting, so it was set. Yes. It was. She spoke those words. She didn't email them to you or anything like that? This was in a meeting?
It was in a meeting, yes.
Okay. Thank you, convener.
All right, come to the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey.
Yeah, thanks very much and good morning to everybody. Just on following on this point that's been made here about state aid rules and so on. The Cabinet Secretary made a clear statement that state aid rules make it impossible to intervene, and that is a view shared by UK government ministers as well. Has the GMB pursued that direction of travel to see what the UK government's view on all of this is?
Yes, we have. From the moment that we heard that there was what the situation regarding the guarantee and the effect that would have on the yards of BIFAB, it was the GMB that pursued a dialogue with the UK government. And I actually think one of the questions that needs to be looked at is at what stage did the UK government begin to initiate a conversation with Westminster in order to intervene on this issue, because our information tells us that that was very late in the day, despite the fact that they knew that they were going to need to provide the guarantee over a year ago and rescinded it at very short notice. And that is something that I think the committee should take up.
Yeah, it's the UK government's ministers' views as well that it is not possible to intervene in circumstances like this. Is that quite clear? Is that correct?
Well,
they both have that view.
That is what they wrote in their statement, so I would have no reason to dispute that.
Okay, just to clear that up, I wonder if I could ask a question to Jason. Good morning, Jason.
Morning.
Some of the members have asked some questions about your own company's level of engagement, involvement, investment, and so on. Can you just explain to us? I mean, how can any of us reasonably expect a successful outcome here if your company and the parent company JV driver haven't really invested anything other than your own resources, your own staffing resources and expertise? There's not really been any level of investment of capital or anything from the two parent companies, let's say, to make these projects a success. How would you respond to that?
You know, I think we set out a business plan that was that could have been very successful for BIFAB. You know, that business plan set out that we were going to revitalize the business, we were going to finish the Beatrice project, we were going to revitalize the business in its existing markets. You know, when a business is trying to turn things around, the primary focus, at least in our view, is on opportunities that are closest to the business at home. And in this particular case, BIFAB had you know, numerous multi-billion-pound projects that were being, you know, that were going to be installed within a stone's throw from their own facilities. So that our view, which was shared by government at the time, is that BIFAB had a competitive advantage and should have a competitive advantage and should be able to pursue and be successful on those projects. And we did that vigorously. I can tell you, all of our staff here, right to our senior management team that's based in Western Canada, pursued and supported that initiative vigorously. Ultimately, the reason that the BIFAB was not successful in all of its pursuits, it was successful in some, but the major projects that was unsuccessful in had nothing to do with the level of investment into the business or into the yards. It had to do with foreign, international, low-cost competition that in many cases was state financed. And that is the single most, the single largest factor that has led to the situation that we currently face with BIFAB, and certainly in our view, the limited impact that Hazel gave some numbers on in terms of the impacts from an employment point of view of the offshore sector for the Scottish and UK supply chain. And it's shocking for me looking at this from I guess as a president of a company that has invested a lot of time and effort and resources into BIFAB. Also from our parent company in Western Canada, because the UK and Scottish supply chains were set up for success to take on a global leadership you know, kind of position on offshore wind from all of the success it had in the oil and gas industry. You know, Scotland was a world leader. We're here in Canada. Our offshore oil and gas sector is in its infancy compared to how established and how successful the Scottish offshore sector has been. And you know, the businesses, many of the businesses that are successful or could have been successful in the offshore wind, had all the necessary skills from the oil and gas sector. So, there were many things that that the Scottish and UK supply chains had to their advantage. Unfortunately, it didn't have the necessary supply chain protections, and the financing for these projects is so onerous, and it's led by large investment firms that require huge amounts of assurance and warranty. The only way, ultimately, now in what we've seen in the last 2 years, that any business operating and wanting to be successful in this sector, the offshore wind sector, is going to need support from government in terms of its endeavors and its pursuits to win contracts. It needs it. It needs protections from government. If not, it's all going to go to the lowest cost provider. And that, in part, a point that we haven't discussed today, is also driven by the contracts for different auctions process. That is a race to the bottom process. It's purely based on price, and it is not reviewed. At least in our view, it is not reviewed substantively based on local supply chain commitments. It is based on the lowest CFD rate. And those are the successful companies. The lowest one that's come out of the auction process, I guess, maybe of all time, but certainly recently, is the Sea Green project. And the Sea Green project is going to be executed from a fabrication and point of view for certain, in terms of scope of competition for BiFab, 100% outside of the UK. It's going to be a 100% Asian and Middle East solution. Without, in some ways, you can't blame the developers for doing that, because it had to be so aggressive on the contract for difference auction price that it drove them to the absolute lowest cost solution, which was in Asia.
Jason, thank you so much for that long, detailed answer. I know my colleague Gordon MacDonald is going to come in on contracts for difference, so I'll hand back to you, convener, and allow Gordon to ask those questions.
Thank you. Yes, Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, convener. Before I go on and ask my questions about contract for difference, last year, Sean, when you were in front of the committee back in April 2019, you highlighted that the Fife Yards had only 30 employees, which were mainly of a management position and a couple of union folk. Can you give us an update of what the situation is today?
Yeah, since that time, we've executed a couple of successful projects that we're pretty proud of, actually. We didn't talk a lot about here today. The Murray East project was executed first in Lewis and then in Fife, a combination of both facilities, employing about 150 people, the tradespeople at the time, plus the management group. And then another project for offshore oil that was also very successful, employed about 30 or 40 people in Fife as well. So that project, those projects spoke a lot to us about the execution ability of the workforce. It was a successful project, safe projects, and we were pretty excited about them. So anyway, the employment, I guess, probably peaked at about 200 people during those projects, 220 maybe. And now we're back down to less than 30 again, probably about 15 or 16 employees.
And, JV Driver is obviously a big multi-million-pound company with fabrication yards predominantly in Canada. Have you brought any work to BiFab from any of your other yards?
No, we have not at this point in time, because a number of things have gotten in the way of that. Primarily COVID-19, in terms of some of our opportunities, have all been pushed back. But the other thing is, too, as Jason pointed out, it was always our first intention to compete successfully in the local market on projects that were the sort of the low-hanging fruit, and we've been focusing on that to try to win work, to get people back to work, to prove the capabilities of the company. So not a lot from Driver at this point in time, because simply because the world economy hasn't allowed for it because of COVID. But other than that, and also beyond that, we've been, as I said, focusing focusing 100% laser sharp on projects in Scotland.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, moving on to contracts for difference. You started to touch upon that, Jason, about contracts for difference, and you've already highlighted that you would like to see supply chain plans with a minimum work guarantee for Scotland's yards. It seems to me from the evidence we heard last week about the competitive pricing has driven down the amount of funds that are available to fabricators and developers, and are being forced to look at the Far East. And, you know, this morning we've heard that there's no supply chain protection, the contract conditions, people are not held to account on it. And one of the bases for introducing contracts for difference was it was provide the cheapest electricity in Europe to consumers. And the EU carry out regular comparisons across Europe, and we see that actually UK electricity prices are in the top third of 30 countries compared. So what I want to ask is, contracts for difference, are they actually used anywhere else in the world? I mean, I know you guys through JV Driver, etc., have contracts all over the world. Does this type of contract exist anywhere else?
I can't answer the specific question, unfortunately, Gordon. If it happens elsewhere, certainly it doesn't happen in other parts of our business. We haven't come up against a kind of an auction process like this. But, you know, certainly the intent of trying to keep the rates as low as possible for the consumer is obviously a positive intent of the contracts for different pricing, to try to make pricing competitive, obviously to reduce the impact on families in Scotland and the UK. However, you know, I think it has the unintended consequence of moving thousands and thousands of high-paying jobs out of the UK and Scottish supply chain. I mean, it's moving these jobs to low-cost jurisdictions in the Middle East and Asia, and in many cases for state-led business. So that the economic impact of that is incredibly substantial and is lost. So, you know, in our view, there needs to be a broader view taken on the CFD auction process to say, yes, of course, we need to keep prices competitive for the ratepayer. However, we need to make sure we're making and having the right support for our economy and for our supply chain, so that the ratepayers who actually are looking for work in those sectors actually have a job to go to. So, you know, we could be thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs ahead, and that in turn is being reinvested into the economy in restaurants and the retail and car sales and home sales and everything else, and it just grows from there. And it's not that in the early days in particular, Scotland and the UK would not have enough capacity to take on 100% of these projects. So we're looking for a relatively small piece of the pie. When we had these discussions and had, you know, done kind of high-level computations on this, in our view, the additional cost to the project and an additional cost to the ratepayer would be negligible, but it would start the process of redomesticating these jobs into the supply chain, which will continue to grow and would have a lasting and tremendous effect on the economy of Scotland, in our opinion.
And Hazel, one question for you. We've seen Scotland lose out to these highly skilled jobs because of the contracts for difference and the drive to the bottom in terms of competitive pricing. How sure is GMB that the operational contracts over the lifetime of a wind farm will actually come to Scottish companies? And what can we do about it when we already see there are centres of excellence being developed south of the border to support and service the offshore wind that's being developed down there? How sure are we that we can actually get these operational jobs to be based in Scotland, to be based in Fife and elsewhere over the 30 years that these wind farms are going to be operational? What can we do to ensure that happens?
Well, it's a very good question because, of course, it's extremely difficult, and there were changes made to the CFD funding mechanism a while ago. I'm not sure the exact date, but I'll come back to the committee on that. And that changed the content to be lifetime content guarantees. And there was a big announcement made in relation to moving that content to 60% recently. However, again, that's over a 30-year potential lifespan of those wind farms, and then we're expecting to look back at it at that stage to see if they actually lived up to that or not at the point in which it's already too late. So we do need to change the CFD system. That is extremely important. And it was the question that was asked earlier, what have we done? With G&B, we've made submissions to the UK government and to BES who are currently doing review of the contract for distance system. But if we continue to do the same thing, we'll get the same results, which is not to bring jobs in manufacturing to the UK. So there are jobs that are produced, but these are largely jobs in law or marketing around the renewable sector, not in actual manufacturing. We're going to lose a skill base if we don't move to change something soon. One of the things that we have heard from the tier 1 contractors is that they want to award work. Seagreen is ultimately under the provision of a Scottish energy company, SSE, and yet there's not jobs coming to Scotland. And what they've told us from their head of renewables, that the companies in the tier 1 just want a level playing field, and they will factor in the cost of manufacturing in the UK and in Scotland into if that is part of the mechanism that they have to go through. But at the moment, they said to us, why there's no incentive. We're disincentivizing manufacturing jobs in the UK and in Scotland at the moment under the current rules and regulations. And we might find out in 30 years' time whether or not they've actually provided that content. But as I said, it's already way too late then.
Okay, thanks very much, convener.
Thank you. Just a quick question to Jason Fudge before I bring Richard Lyle back in for a further question. You've talked a lot about legislation being necessary to deal with this. Now, 2 questions in that respect. I mean, we've heard the reference to the French having more vociferous lawyers. So one can have all the legislation in the world, but if a government or there isn't a culture, shall we say, of seeking to fight one's own corner on something and enforce legislation or enforce requirements in contracts, it's not going to change the end result. So that's the first point. And then the second point is, I think you've made clear, of course, you don't have a comparative knowledge, indeed, probably no one does, of the legal systems of the world. But looking at Canada, where you do seem to indicate you have some understanding of how the legislative setup works there, I mean, you have both federal and provincial governments. So would you agree it's necessary for both to work together to bring about such legislation and also bring about a culture that does protect local supply chains and the local market? So perhaps if you could comment on those 2 questions before we come to Richard Lyle.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for those questions, convener. In the first part, in terms of legislation, obviously we view that to be very, very, very important in Scotland and the UK in terms of supply chain protection. Right now, that legislation just doesn't exist. So there's nothing there to enforce. The supply chain plan that I referred to earlier was concurrent. It was a plan that was presented by a developer for use in the initial consenting process, but ultimately was unenforceable because there was no legislation that included that plan as an enforceable item. So, the state aid rules and EU open market rules, based on feedback from Scottish government, prevent them from doing that. And I think that that's something that needs to change. I'm not sure how that has to change, but if it doesn't change, then the Scottish and UK supply chains are always going to be at a competitive disadvantage in relation to companies in other lower cost jurisdictions, including the Middle East and Asia. So that is something that needs to change. Here in Canada, we have a different set of legislation, kind of a capacity that's available to us. We, in particular, here in our operations in Eastern Canada, work primarily on energy projects. They aren't offshore wind projects, they're hydro and oil and gas projects. But in all of these cases on major infrastructure projects that are, multi-billion-dollar projects, very similar in commercial scope to the offshore wind projects in Scotland, there is the developer and the applicable governments, be it federal or provincial, all that agree on a supply chain, and that supply chain plan is actually written into legislation and is 100% enforceable. And in my experience here operating in Eastern Canada for the last 20 years, primarily working on energy infrastructure projects, there has never been an instance where a developer has not lived up to those projects. And if there was a situation where there was a component of the work that was intended to be done in Canada that ultimately was not done in Canada, they paid a massive penalty to the government in relation to that. So we view that to be very important. We think the Scottish government and the UK government should be working together on side by side to ensure that the necessary legislation and rules are in place to protect the Scottish supply chain for offshore wind.
But on that further question about vociferous lawyers or culture, as it were, I mean, these things, even if they are in legislation in Canada, are enforced in respect of private companies through agreed contracts and obviously through the courts. And if a company has the understanding that they're not going to be brought to the courts to meet up to or fulfill their obligations, surely that would make a difference to how they approach their obligations.
I agree, but in Canada, it has not been an issue. So, and in fact, if there is an issue where there is work that isn't done, the penalties and other requirements are absolutely enforced and paid by the developer. The issue that we see in Scotland is that the commitments are not enforceable. There isn't a legislation in place that would allow government to take an aggressive position to actually enforce the supply chain plan. So I think that is the critical first step that needs to happen. And then obviously the government at hand, be it the Scottish or UK government, needs to take the initiative to ensure that those agreements and legislation are enforced with developers.
All right, well, we'll come to a question from Richard Lyle.
Yeah, this is to Jason or Hazel. We know many countries have job safeguards. If we don't safeguard our contracts, we won't win any. You've basically told us that this morning. So should the Scottish Government do the same as other governments are seen to have done, ignore state aid rules and make sure contracts stay in Scotland by devising ways to ensure that, say by carbon footprint reasons, etc.?
I mean, I think the Scottish government should do everything, and the UK government should do everything that it can to pursue these projects. I'm certainly not advocating that they break rules and that sort of thing, but it needs to explore every opportunity available to it. And I think the EU rules need to change. I mean, and as we cited the example previously, BIFAB is bound by EU state aid and open market rules, even when it is not competing against EU companies. So we were actually, it became problematic for us to provide assurances, guarantees, and working capital financing for a project in which we had no European competition. So how does those rules make sense? In my view, it's meant to protect, ensure that there is a level playing field across across Europe and the economic union. But it should not, at a minimum, be enforced for competition outside of Europe. I mean, I don't think that makes sense for anybody. But without understanding all the specifics of the rules, at least what we've seen with BIFAB, and I think we've seen in the supply chain for offshore wind more broadly, is that these rules need to change to ensure that the maximum amount of work is done by the Scottish people and the UK people in the respective supply chains.
Thank you.
All right, I think Sean Fudge, did you want to come in and say something on this? Sorry, not Sean. Sorry, I'm now confusing names. Not Sean Fudge, Jason Fudge. Apologies to both of you for conflating your names. Perhaps not as.
No problem at all.
Yes.
No problem at all. I just wanted to point out the question was asked. I think you asked about Canada being a federal provincial system and how that compares to Scotland and the and the benefits. In Canada, and we're involved in a lot of mining projects as well, a lot of resource projects, but a lot of big projects overall. And in Canada, the resources are generally considered to be the property of the provinces. And when a company comes in to develop those resources, the agreements on development have to be between the developer and the province. So it's the province who stipulates the benefits agreements as a separate agreement with the developer that is enforceable in the courts.
All right. I think, unless there's any further questions from members, I think Hazel Nolan, sorry, wanted to perhaps make comment. Perhaps Hazel Nolan to round things off, as it were.
Yeah, I just think that, you know, it's not down to any one thing. You know, if we want to have a successful Scottish supply chain, we need to have, you know, the investment in terms of the infrastructure to be able to build it. We need to have the proper funding mechanisms that support the Scottish supply chain, support a UK supply chain, and we need to have political will. And on all three fronts, as it currently stands, it looks like we're lacking. I don't see why, for example, you know, it was a very pertinent question that was made earlier about why couldn't the Scottish government perhaps delay the decision and then it would be outside of the parameters of state rules. We're not asking for people to break the rules, but on all these three fronts, there's been an absolute lack, and that's why, as I said, we are 100,000 jobs short of the predictions that where we were, and this is much bigger than just the ins and outs of what's happened around LNG and Seagreen. And there was a question, yes, about environmental concerns, and I absolutely believe that we should be factoring those in when it comes to the construction of these wind farms. You know, there's a reason that we're doing this. It's to have a better future for our children and for our country and for our world, and that's why we're doing that. But at the moment, you know, if you look at the UK's impact on CO2 emissions over the last decade, and you include imports, all we've done is we've offshore jobs and we've imported virtue, because we're still contaminating the environment the same amount, because, you know, we're building offshore wind in China and we're shipping it back, as I said, on diesel boats halfway across the world. It's absolutely ludicrous, you know. And just think of the predicament of Scottish workers. You know, they are paying through their energy bills for the construction of these wind farms. They can see them from their homes and they're not getting the work involved in it. We're going to lose the skill base in the very short future, because why would you, as a young person living in Fife, invest in welding, for example? Why would you do that at this stage? And it's an absolute tragedy. And from a union perspective, we've seen that there is, you know, everyone's lining up to finger point the blame about where this lies. We're not interested in blame anymore. We're just interested in solutions. That's what we have to focus on.
Thank you very much. That was a very vociferous dog in the background there. So we've heard from, I think, everyone, apart from Alex Rowley wants to come in with an extremely brief question, and we'll see, or comment, and we'll see perhaps if one of our panel can come back with a very short, sharp, witty reply. Alex.
Convener, I want to conclude by asking the question of where do we go now? I know in the statement that was issued from BIFAB earlier this week, they say BIFAB management proposed several project execution alternatives to keep the work at BIFAB's facilities in Scotland. They say this includes an option to work alongside CPEM in the Fife Yards with the full support of our union partners. BIFAB management invited the Scottish ministers to jointly present this option to CPAM and NNG developer EDF. Unfortunately, this did not happen. This option still exists today. So for the workers in Fife and for Scotland, is there still options on the table that could bring work and save these yards?
I think the question of where we go now, I think our witnesses have given their comments on a variety of matters, and I think we now are out of time. So I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us, and of course the committee will carefully consider what all of you have said and where we think matters should go now as a committee. So thank you very much. I'll suspend the meeting to change over witnesses. Thank you. Welcome to agenda item 3. We now continue taking evidence on our inquiry into the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's businesses, workers and the economy. Today's focus is on rural areas. We have about 1 hour for this session, and I'd welcome our witnesses, all of whom are joining the meeting remotely. We have first of all Stephen Montgomery, from the Scottish Hospitality Group, Graham Galloway, Programme Director, Developing the Young Workforce, Dumfries and Galloway, and Jackie Briarton, who's the CEO of GrowBiz Scotland. So just to say that if you could allow our broadcasting colleagues a few seconds to turn your microphones on before you start, and we will then move to questions. And if you want to speak, please do raise your hand or type R in the chat box. And if you have any other points you need to raise in terms of how the meeting is running, please just type that in the chat box and we'll seek to deal with that. So if I might start with a fairly general question to our witnesses, and that is about your own assessment of how rural communities and rural businesses have managed to cope with the pandemic and the rules that they've been subjected to, and in particular what issues rural enterprises and young people have faced. I don't know who would like to comment on that first. Jackie Briarton.
Yes, good morning. It's difficult to have a generalised approach to an answer to this because obviously the crisis has affected rural economies in different parts of Scotland and different sectors quite differently. But undoubtedly the businesses that we've been supporting since 2/3 of them have been in severe difficulties and faced great hardship. Some of them have already closed. Some of them have been able to reasonably well. But counterintuitively, we're also seeing a number of new businesses coming forward and people with viable ideas and sometimes taking advantage of some of the opportunities that have come up because of COVID. So it's quite a mixed picture. But one of the big difficulties for rural businesses in particular is the way they've fallen through the slats, as it were, in financial assistance available. I can go into that in more detail if necessary. But just a point on young people, one of the things for us is that we're seeing more young people in rural areas wanting to stay in rural areas, sometimes because they don't have a choice and sometimes actively wanting to create a living there. But the current schemes, which are on the face of it good and generous, Kickstart, the UK Kickstart scheme and the Scottish Government's Young Persons Guarantee scheme, but neither of them allow for young people to create their own businesses. There's no mechanism to allow them to develop their ideas and no finance within those systems, which and I think it reflects a lack of focus on entrepreneurship, encouraging people to create their own jobs, because some rural areas want to do that, but there's no specific support to do that. And the last point I'd make at the moment is that the new startups I talked about, whether they're young people or others, there's a great lack of access to startup finance. There are no schemes available at the moment. And unfortunately, the banks are not opening new business bank accounts. So it's very difficult. If people don't have their own capital, it's very difficult for them to find the finance to set up these new businesses.
Thank you. Do either of the other witnesses want to comment at this stage, or shall? Yes, Stephen Montgomery and then Graham Galloway.
Good morning, Committee, and thank you very much for inviting Scottish Hospitality Group onto this this morning. Scottish Hospitality Group, myself, responsible for over 200 sites, and we spread the length and breadth of Scotland, rural and city centre. Employ 6,000 people with a turnover of 275 million. Many of our 6,000 employees, probably about 1,400 to 1,500 of those are between the age group of 16 and 24. So young employment is a very, very big interest for us. Our sector, I think you'll know, has been very badly hit throughout COVID. Through since the beginning of July, when we opened up, 15 people were allowed, then 8/2 families, 6/2 families, the farcical music ban, the 10 o'clock curfew, and that's affected the businesses right the way throughout city centre and rural. Rural pubs depend on a lot of community. A lot of the people in the community depend on the pubs and the restaurants as a safe place to go to socialise. We are a safe place to go, and we've been hit by very, very many restrictions, far, far more restrictions than what we've seen in the rest of the UK. So it is a very, very hard sector at the moment. No grants available worth talking about. So yeah, we are very, very badly hit. So I think it's a big, big subject for us at the moment.
And Graham Galloway. I think we're not hearing you, so I'm wondering if is your own mic muted by any chance? I think your mic may be muted, Graham, or else the sound desk. I'm not sure if they can assist here. I don't think so. I think, can you perhaps... Do you want to try that again, Graham? See if we can hear you now. All right, I'm sorry, Graham, we're not, I'm afraid, hearing you here, so we'll try and sort that out. We'll move on to other questions, and we'll bring you in later if we can get the sound sorted so that you can bring in your comments at that point. So Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. COVID-19 has affected us all, both at our work and leisure, and all types of businesses have been affected. We all know that there is a reliance in rural Scotland on employment from a small number of sectors particularly tourism. Cities have much more sectoral diversity of employment. Has this reliance on tourism been reflected in the public sector support? And if not, what actions are needed?
I take it that's for, is that for me, Richard?
Stephen, Stephen, if you...
Sorry. Yeah, I think, you know, rural tourism, a lot of our employees are from the local area, you know, and they depend. And what we try to do is we try to keep our local people local, because if we lose them to city centres, or we lose them either to Europe or to other places. So the Kickstart scheme that came in was a good one if we can utilise that. But at the moment, we're faced with so many different tier systems that, you know, from 1 week we're open to a week we're not. We don't know where we are. So at the moment, we have a big problem with not knowing, you know, when we can trade and when we can't trade, and trying to stay viable at the moment is a very big problem for us. So rurally, a lot of places are shut at the moment because it's not viable for them to trade. So most of our staff are on the furlough payments as well, which is obviously a big help for us. But clarity is what we're needing. And I think that's got to be looked at very, very soon, before we already see so many big businesses already closing. If you look at, you know, Gleneagles, for example, already shut down. If you look at Auchenrani, on our end shut down. You look at, you know, a lot of the big major places in Scotland and rural places who have actually closed down because of the viability, and with no help coming from governments as far as grants are concerned to cover them out, because a lot of the rateable values that we see are over 51,000. And I think whenever the pivotal and hardship scheme came out originally, the first lockdown, only 8% of tourism businesses that applied, or hospitality businesses, sorry, that applied for the pivotal and tourism grant were accepted. So we are faced with this all the time. The banks aren't helping either, because they've gone on a traffic light system. Something similar to 2008, 2009, where road haulage was put on that same system. We are finding now also that more rurally, that banks are not giving our youth, younger people, mortgage applications now, because of hospitality being on the traffic light system, even down to small overdrafts as well. So we're in a bit of a dilemma at the moment that we need some very, very immediate action on.
Yes, well, you know, we've basically in a situation where I think that there is confusion out there. Some people don't know what tier they're in. Some people don't know whether they should be open. I love the emails that I'm getting that are complaining that this shop's open, but I can't open. So what would you suggest, anyone, that we do to resolve this confusion, which my view is there is a lot of confusion? How do we resolve it?
Personally, I think, you know, from as far as hospitality, well, certainly from my point of view, government need to sit down, both UK and Scottish government need to sit down, open the door, talk to hospitality more than what they're talking to us. You know, we get a call, I'm in a group that we get a call once a week to tell us basically what's happening, not what they're planning on doing. We have no input at all, and we have, SHG in particular, have put in so many different proposals to the Scottish Government to try and alleviate the issues that we're getting hit with. Some of the restrictions are coming in, the guidance, like for example, the last one with the tier level system. We got that information at 8:20 on a Friday evening, which was coming into effect at 6 o'clock on the Monday morning. Now, we cannot plan, operators can't plan for that. You know, when they're putting in food orders, they're putting in beer orders and everything, probably 3 to 4 days ahead on lead time, and we can't have that. You know, so the Scottish Hospitality Group as a whole, as our group, would encourage Scottish Government to sit down with us, give us a seat at the table and discuss the issues that they have, and allow us to discuss the issues that we have, to allow for an easier working relationship, so we can tell our operators and their staff, if you like, where they are and what they plan to do, because there is confusion both from an operator's point of view and also from a customer point of view, which is more important as well.
Anyone else? Jackie? Jackie?
Thank you. Could I just come in on your original point, Mr. Lyle, the issue around tourism dominating the rural economy, which you're right, obviously a lot of areas in Scotland are dependent on tourism, but there's a huge number of diverse enterprises and businesses beside that. And what we're seeing, certainly from the range of businesses that we're supporting, is that there's quite a lot in the creative services sector, for example, who are finding different ways of selling their products and their art, etc. We're also seeing a huge increase in different ways of providing care and well-being, and that's providing jobs. Complex, but I think I totally sympathise and agree with Stephen. I mean, the businesses in hospitality have been hugely badly hit, but we're kind of forgetting that there's a whole range of other businesses in rural that are able to grow and survive, but they need support. And I think, if anything, the lobby for tourism and for some other sectors has drowned out the fact that there are other businesses who could be actually providing employment and growing, but they're not getting any attention, which isn't to say that hospitality is not critical in that. I'm just saying there probably needs to be more balance and an opportunity for the voices of these other businesses to be heard.
Graeme, are you able to get in, or if not, I'll finish at that, convener.
No, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, thank you. That's
yes,
much
excellent.
better.
Carry on.
It's just to say, I mean, we work with a number of business sector forums across Dumfries and Galloway, and it's probably fair to say COVID's hit different sectors in different ways. So when I look at the engineering sector, for example, they're fairly buoyant, particularly those that are manufacturing for agriculture and agricultural business buildings and such like. But you go to the other extreme, in hospitality and tourism is by far and away our worst affected industry, and it's clearly a very important industry for Dumfries and Galloway, and it's almost decimated, I have to say. And I look at the events that the region holds throughout the year, such as the Wigton Book Festival or the Eden Festival, which are big draws into the region for tourists and others. They've all been wiped out. So it is a mixed bag. As I say, some industries are working well, but others, in particularly hospitality and tourism, have been hit by far and away the hardest.
Thanks, convener. That's been.
Alex Rowley.
I understand the impact on tourism in particular. It's not just in rural parts, obviously. But has there been any difficulties with regarding the different levels in the country, which I support, because it seems it's sensible to try and keep parts of the economy open as much as we can. But at the same time, I live in level 3, and I'm sure that people in the Highlands would not want people for level 3 or level 4 heading up into the Highlands. So can I ask specifically around the travel restrictions that have been put in place? Is that generally supported? Is it a recognition that health comes first, or do people feel that there's difficulties and they would prefer to see the rural economy continuing to be opened up? And could I also ask specifically around what other areas is there for potential growth within the rural economy? I mean, one that jumps out is certainly forestry, which would help us tackle a lot of other issues around environmental issues. But where is there the potential for growth within the rural economy in Scotland?
Stephen Montgomery. Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for the question. This is exactly where I come back to where Mr. Lyle's question was, where if we had been given a seat at the table when the development of the level systems in Scotland had been taking place, we would have been able to have alleviated a lot of the problems that we see now with, the different people travelling from different tiers to different table or levels to levels. Sorry, if you take it to Dumfries and Galloway for an example, where I am, and Graeme will probably back me up, we are stuck now in the middle where we have on the south side of us an English lockdown, who will be coming out now and probably this week into level 2, which borders on our level 2, level 3 in Scotland. And then to the north of us, we have from South Lanarkshire to Ayrshire and further up Central Belt, which is in level 4. So we are continually trying to make sure that, you know, we don't accept people from outside those levels, even the level 1 area coming into level 2. Now, if we had been given some prior warning and given some input into the level systems, we would have been able to adapt those tier systems where, for viability of businesses, for example, if you take tier 2 and tier 3 in Scotland, or level 2 and level 3, level 3, you're only allowed to open from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night with no alcohol. Those hours are completely arbitrary. Now, peak times are 12 to half 2, and then from say 5 o'clock to half 8, 9 o'clock. So we can't get an evening service at the moment in tier 3, which means then people will look to travel somewhere else if they have an occasion. If you take it, for example, Mid Lothian going to East Lothian, one's in level 2, one's in level 3. So people will do that. We have the other issue again as in Dumfries and Galloway, where people will come across the border from England to maybe Dumfries and Galloway because we're in a lower tier, because they can't get that in England. Although England at the moment are saying 10 o'clock as being their kick-out time. Last orders, 11 o'clock kick-out time. Whereas here in level 2, we are allowed to serve alcohol with a meal inside. This is where it gets confusing. With a meal inside, but without a meal outside. So if we're allowed to serve at 10 o'clock in the evening time, hoteliers in all areas will be allowed to serve their residents, because if a resident comes in at 9 o'clock for an evening meal, he can't have an alcoholic drink, and there's absolutely no reason, and there's no scientific reason why somebody can't have a glass of wine with a meal. So I think if these tier systems had been sat down and talked to us with before they were published, we would have been able to certainly have had a better input into stopping people crossing from tier to tier.
Okay. And would anybody want to pick up on my question around growth areas for the rural economy?
Jackie Briarton wanted to come in, I think, and then Graham Galloway.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Early's first point, just briefly, in terms of the support for the different tiers, we hear a lot of support from rural villages and towns. They are supportive of keeping their areas safe and to up the restrictions. I think the biggest issue is the time available to prepare for those. And I think when decisions are made quite quickly, time to then adapt, that's when the problems are. So we have a situation at the moment where there's still uncertainty, obviously, whether the tier 3s and 4s are going to stay the way they are. So it's almost impossible for, say, an accommodation business in the Highlands, for example, with catering, when Christmas and New Year would be one of their big income periods. Can they go ahead and promote them because they can legally attract people from other areas? So I think it's the consistency and the ability to plan ahead that's the biggest issue, which is one of the reasons why it's like businesses like Gleneagles, etc., have just made that decision to close, because it's actually easier and more cost effective. Some of the smaller businesses don't have that luxury. They've got to try and bring income in some way. And many of them, as I said earlier, don't qualify for any business for various reasons. And I'd make the strong point that there are still that huge wodge of self-employed, a huge group of self-employed people in rural areas and urban, but rural areas particularly, who just haven't qualified for a complex range of reasons. If they've got a mixture of employment and self-employment, they don't qualify for the self-employment grant. If they've only started a business within the last 12 to 18 months, they don't qualify for self-employment grant. So there's a lot of barriers to people actually going forward. But going on to your second point around this for rural growth, I think there's huge potential. I would go so far as to say that, ironically, in the face of the crime got, that there could be an actual golden period ahead for rural areas if we can encourage and resource the businesses that want to come to rural to set up. Because what we're seeing, and you'll be aware of this yourselves, that there's a huge number of people making their own lives to move into rural areas who wouldn't have considered it before, partly because of the experience of the last 9 months, and sometimes just because they want a change, they want to have a different way of living. And you know, we see anecdotally where I'm based in Perthshire, rural are disappearing before they even go on the market because people are looking to move. Now, traditionally, that would be more retired people. What we're seeing are people of age with families who are making a positive decision to move to rural. They're coming with skills, with knowledge, with capital, with that and innovative ideas that could be developed in a range of things. Digital connectivity is critical to that. Where there's good digital connectivity, people can run any business in any sector. We can see that now. We've seen evidence of that in the way so many people have been able to adapt to home working, for example. We're seeing niche manufacturers set up where they're selling across the UK and further beyond. We're seeing technical. We're currently helping a business in the Blairgowrie area who's developing potentially a game-changing technology using infrared photography. They're doing a trial with Ninewells Hospital. So you know, you can be based anywhere in Scotland and be running a growth business, but we have to accept that those businesses will need support in a way that might be slightly different for urban, and the access to capital, that is still a major issue. That business I've just referred to in the Blairgowrie area should be absolutely fit the bill for research and development funding that would normally be available, but they can't access an R&D grant because they're suspended at the moment. So I think the summary answer to the question is absolutely there are many areas, and I've not mentioned any of the extractive forestry, developing agriculture, etc., because they're almost a given. There are opportunities there, but it's in all the other niches that we should be looking. And I just finished by saying that I mentioned care and wellbeing earlier. There's a huge opportunity to develop a viable care and wellbeing infrastructure within rural Scotland, where we're not only creating viable employment for people, providing social care services in communities to support and other mechanisms, but that's almost going to be necessary because the statutory services are going to continue to struggle to support communities with the right level of social care. I know that's a whole other area, another discussion probably, but it is a potential growth area for employment.
Did Graham Galloway want to make a brief comment on that question as well?
Just the same, I think generally people are quite supportive of the tiers that exist, but we do feel somewhat sandwiched between England and the Central Belt, as has already been said. There's certainly a feeling within the Chamber of Commerce, which hosts the DYW in Dumfries and Galloway, that we'd like to see us move to a tier 1 for flexibility reasons within business, and that obviously our COVID rates are falling. And just touching on what Jackie said there, I definitely think for rural areas there is opportunities as a result of the COVID pandemic. Is very similar to Perthshire. We're seeing our housing market is extremely buoyant with people moving into rural areas. Whilst there's still issues with digital connectivity across some of the more rural parts of our region, there's definitely opportunities there that people can see that they've been working from home for months now, and actually the world hasn't stopped turning as a result of them being in a remote area. They can access the internet, they can still do their role, they can still do their jobs. Even if they're based in Glasgow or Edinburgh or elsewhere, they can actually still undertake their role within a rural area such as Dumfries and Galloway. So somewhat perversely, as I say, COVID-19 is actually a bit of a boon for us, or could be in the future when people realise the possibility of remote working.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on then to questions from Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. question to Stephen Montgomery, if I may. Stephen, have you got any evidence of people travelling between tiers to access hospitality?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, we have, as Graham just said, and we said earlier on, we are seeing people where we are squashing Dumfries and Galloway here between the English border and Tier 4, even back to the weekend before last. And I'm going to be quite honest and brutal about this, but we were subjected to a weekend of absolute torrent and abuse from people coming from the Central Belt, possibly going to, I would say, possibly the Gretna Gateway area to do some Christmas shopping. At that time, we were in Tier 3, I think, where people wanted to book in for Sunday lunch or a bite to eat or whatever. And we have a protocol where we ask for a postcode, where they're coming from, all that kind of thing when people ring. And whenever you tell them that you cannot, we couldn't take the booking because of where they're from, the abuse that the staff are taking, et cetera, is just, frankly, not acceptable.
And have you heard of any other businesses suffering the same abuse?
Yes, we are. Yes, I run a couple of Facebook groups, etc., and it is quite a scene across the borders as well. People over on the East Coast, possibly people going to maybe the Newcastle area where they shouldn't have been going to anyway, because of the prevalence in Newcastle. So yes, it is a bit of an issue. So hopefully it'll be resolved soon.
Okay, that's interesting. Can I ask? It probably is you, Stephen, but others may have a view. Have you had any experience of trying to access any of the funds available? I mean, there's the latest one, which was launched at the start of November, for businesses that have been, particularly in your sector, I think, Stephen, forced to close. Any experience of using these?
Yes, we have quite a negative view on that, because if you look at the Central Belt, for example, from the 9th of October to the beginning of November, which was supposed to be the short shop shock, which has now gone into a lot longer, there was a £2,000, £3,000 grants available to those that were forced closed. Now, if you take it on that grant system, the £2,000 for anybody up to a rateable value of £18,000 and £3,000 for anybody up to £51,000. That is capped on the amount of people, many sites you have as well. I think it's 5 at the moment. After the grants are taken off, our businesses are losing £5,089 a week compared to a £2,000 grant a month. So on the back of that, the First Minister announced a £9 million pot for the 20% furlough top-up, which then digressed into a £1,650 payment. Here we are at the end of November, and that still hasn't gone out to hundreds of businesses in hospitality. So in my view, the planning, execution, and everything around that was completely wrong. Here we have businesses, both rural, who are dependent on it because we're harder hit, maybe not so harder hit as the Central Belt, but certainly harder hit as far as footfall is concerned, suffering at the hands of what hasn't been actioned before the release of a restriction.
Okay, one more question, convener, from me, and that's to Jackie Brighton. Jackie, you mentioned at the start that the banks weren't opening new accounts for people who want to set up businesses. Have you heard of? Is this a big problem?
Yes, it is a major problem actually. So we actually I had the opportunity to raise a forum with Mr. Hepburn, the business minister, and I think he made some inquiries, and the bank's response was that they were too busy providing the CBIL and BBL loans, administering them, and they had to prioritise them, so they weren't able to open new bank accounts. Some of our clients have been told there'll be a 12-week delay before they can open a new account, and in many cases they have simply not been able to communicate with their banks or get a conversation with somebody about either a product or an overdraft. or a new account. Now, obviously, if you're starting a small business, you don't absolutely need a business account, but it's good practice to have one. And in order to qualify for some of the assistance, you need a business account. So it's actually causing quite a lot of issues for our businesses. The additional bank issue in the rural areas that obviously we have there's been a huge closure programme across most of the banks. So in many small towns and villages, we have no banks. And with the new tier system, we were told recently that the mobile banking system would be suspended for tier 3, as well as presume tier 4 as well. So there's numerous problems with the banks, and I think it's going to be really important that they come back on stream for a number of reasons if we're going to get that buoyancy back for businesses going forward.
Thanks for that.
All right, Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to go back to a comment that was made earlier on, very early in this discussion, which related to young people. I'd be interested to know what the panel thinks the impact on young people in rural Scotland has been as a result of the pandemic, and in particular in relation to access to the labour market. Any volunteer? Jackie.
Yes, thank you. So as I said earlier, we have quite a lot of involvement with young people. At the moment, we're working with them to create a smart village for young people. And what we're seeing is more young people showing interest in staying in rural areas, sometimes parts been talking about, but they need opportunities. And there's too many barriers in the way to help them to either find employment, often to start their own business or become self-employed, because in rural areas, creating their own job may be the only way that they can stay where they are. But I mentioned the Young People's Guarantee Scheme, which is very focused on creating training opportunities and employment opportunities that enables young people to start their own business or to even start social enterprise with other young people. The pandemic has had a major effect on young people generally. I think that's well documented. Some of the surveys that have been done, including one by the Rural Youth Project with other organisations, have highlighted the impact on young people's mental health, for example, particularly again in rural areas where, on top of the issues around where their future lies, they've got the issues of social isolation. Many of them have said that they will, if they had, for example, connectivity, that would make a huge difference both to their prospects, employment prospects, and to their social interaction. And that's still an issue. Come back to this constantly within the rural context, but it is still an issue in too many areas that digital connectivity is not good enough.
You mentioned, sorry, I was just going to say, you mentioned barriers. You mentioned obviously the broadband and so on technology side. What other significant barriers do young people have in terms of either starting their own businesses or getting into the workforce?
So I think I'd highlight three. There's the access to capital, which we've touched on, and I think that's a particular issue for young people and to other businesses that are also looking for capital. Many young people have nothing to fall back on and no savings, and actually where they might have got from family and friends in the past, that's less likely now because of the pressures on people. So access to capital is critical, but alongside that, kind of support for young people. So young people respond well to peer mentoring, peer support, mentor, having somebody that is a sounding board and a sort of continuous support, not just a one-off meeting to tell them what it is, but that kind of ongoing, more relational type of support really works well with young people. And there's a number of schemes in place, but probably enough I think the third one is a standard, apart from the digital one that we've discussed. I think the standard one is transport in rural areas, because for a young person to be successful, whether it's finding a job or creating a business, they need to have access to the right transport. Still a major issue in many areas of Scotland. Again, well documented, but it's even more important if we think about the whole the emphasis on the green economy. That's something that needs a lot of attention anyway, and for young people, it's a critical issue.
I think Graham indicated he wanted to come in. No, Stephen it was Stephen.
I think both, but we'll take Stephen first and then Graham.
Yeah, I think both of us. From hospitality point of view, I think the first step for any young youth at the moment, their first job is normally in hospitality. And in rural areas, it's their local bar, it's their local hotel as a waitress point of view, or a waiter, whatever the case may be, or a pot washer. So it gives them a really good insight to handling money, a bit of confidence, and everything for their future careers. But I think, the good thing that has maybe come out of this is the Adopt Apprentice. I mean, I do a lot of work with Springboard, the charity, as well. We're continuing into the schools and promoting hospitality in our academies. So getting our youth younger, if you like, to try and progress them into hospitality and keep them in the local area is always a good thing. But the Adopt Apprentice scheme, which is going to come out now, which is a really good thing, where if one hospitality business has got an apprentice in, and they maybe are closing down, or facing where they can't keep the apprentice on, we can draw a CV up from their qualities that they've got already, and that goes with them then to maybe another hotel in the area that actually is looking to take people on. So I think that's a good thing that's come out of it. But on the downside of it is there's a bit of a mental health issue as well, where our youth don't know where they are at the moment, because that may be because if they are in hospitality, where they don't know whether they're getting a shift or whether they're not getting a shift, because they don't know whether they're open or whether they're closed. So there is a big mental health issue here as well. But certainly the apprenticeship and the young person guarantee scheme for rural economy should be a good thing.
And I think Graham wanted to come in.
Yeah, it's had a massive impact on young people, and I just look at Dumfries and Galloway, and a couple of indicators, I suppose, are universal credit claimants have gone up 72% from January to October this year. This is 16 to 24-year-olds. And I look at modern apprenticeships in Q2, they have fallen, the opportunities for young people have fallen 64%, which is actually better than the Scottish average, but it's still horrendous. And these are indicators that young people are suffering. We know that far more stayed on at school this year as well, because the opportunities just weren't there for them. And it's already been touched upon, the difficulties with transport links for young people is very, very real. And also the dispersed nature of the population makes it much harder for them to access skills training and to access business support as well. So these are all kind of challenges for it, but there's no doubt, and there's a lot of academic papers now suggesting, with the lost COVID generation, I don't think it's quite as bad as that, but it's very, very tough times for young people just now, and I certainly welcome the young person guarantee that was announced to actually try and address some of that.
Talking about the young person guarantee, what is the role and how effective has the role been of developing the young workforce regional groups in rolling this out? And how is the guarantee actually communicated to young people in rural areas?
Yeah, so from our perspective, we try and target what we call the key influencers. So clearly parents in the wider family are a key influence of what a young person decides to do with their career. The educational and business influences as well are really important. Now, most of the money that's gone towards DYW is going into the creation of new school coordinators, which has been left at a regional level for a decision to be made how best to actually implement that we've gone down a teacher-led route for various reasons after discussions with education and our key partners that already work in school, SDS and employability and skills. It's about actually changing the mindset, I suppose, of school management teams to understand the importance of vocational training as well as academic learning. So we are busy advertising for teachers within the schools just now to really push the DYW agenda. And one of the key things there is to ensure that local employers are tied into local secondary schools across the region, and to ensure that young people have access to mentoring, have access to insight into those industries that operate within Dumfries and Galloway. It's often said our region, unfortunately, our biggest exporter is young people. And Jackie's touched on that about trying to retain young people, trying to attract young people back into regions such as ours is critical. So we have an important role to play. It's about reaching out to young people, and COVID has made that difficult. There's no doubt about that, and we've taken a lot of our offer online, both at a national level and locally as well, to ensure that we are reaching out to young people so they understand the opportunities that are available to them within rural areas.
Does anyone else have a comment on that particular aspect? Jackie.
Yes, I just wanted to come back backing up what Graham was saying about the issues for young people. I noticed a stat the other day, and it's already old, till July, but the increase in unemployment to young people in the Highlands area went from 3.8% to 9.9% in July, and I'm sure it's probably worse now, which just puts more emphasis on how we need to help young people. But I just wanted to come back to the guarantee scheme's good because it puts emphasis on finding opportunities for young people, but there isn't actual funding available to employer local organisations within that scheme. Kickstart, which is the UK scheme, should be completing that and helping that. But unfortunately, some of the criteria, the eligibility within Kickstart makes it really difficult, particularly for rural businesses. As you'll know, you have to be able to take on 30 young people before you can qualify, or you use an intermediary, but you still need 3 employees in order to take on a young people. So for a small micro business in a rural area, that becomes really difficult. And yet that scheme provides $1,500 per business, or per young person rather, for the business to invest. So it's a good opportunity when they're also getting the wages. But the barriers in the way of smaller businesses taking advantage of that and providing opportunities for young people are quite considerable.
Right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We now move to questions from Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. And I've got a couple of areas I want to ask some questions on, but before I do, I've got a question for Stephen. Stephen, you highlighted some difficulties with grants that were available. I think it was the COVID-19 Restrictions Fund and Hardship Fund that was introduced by the Scottish Government based on rateable value. Now, these are being distributed by local authorities. What discussions have you had with local authorities, either the Scottish Hospitality Group itself or your member companies with local authorities to find out the difficulty in getting the funds released to you?
I think, to be fair, a lot of the issues don't relate to local authorities. I think the main issues relate to any conversations I've had with the actual people that are dealing with the Scottish Government, where at the moment, where as far as the 20% pop-up furlough, which turned into £1,650 grant, goes, they're still trying, they say, to navigate away how this is paid. Now, that could be paid very simply, the same way as they pay the hardship grant and the forced close grants. So I don't see what the hold-up is there, or is it the fact that they're still trying to work out where the money's coming from, or we're not sure. We can't get a straight answer. But all we're getting off our operators and our businesses people is, this money should have been ready for distribution at the very start, whenever the restrictions were put in place, and that seems to be an ongoing issue. For hospitality as a whole, not just for SHG, but as far as hospitality in Scotland and all the trade bodies are concerned, where there is no engagement. And you know, these things need to be planned out. The financial side of things need to be planned out. The execution of it needs to be planned out before the actual restrictions go live. And that seems to be an ongoing problem that is causing major worries, both financially and mentally, for our operators.
So just moving on to general support for businesses. You know, hospitality is very important in our rural areas. We've got a lot of self-employed people that run small businesses. It's tourist related. Yet the figures we've been given for both the job retention scheme and the self-employment scheme would suggest that rural areas' claim rate is lower than the Scottish average. For instance, job retention scheme, the Scottish average take-up is 7.4%. 13 out of 15 rural businesses are below the Scottish average for those eligible. And self-employed scheme, 66% take-up, 12 out of the 15 rural areas are below the Scottish average. Is there a particular issues why rural businesses and self-employed people in rural areas taking advantage of the grants that are available? Jackie?
I think, sorry, go ahead, Jackie.
Yes, I think there's several reasons or several issues there. So one is there's such a multiplicity of schemes and things going on that we found a lot of clients, a lot of businesses that approach us are just very confused, and some of them lines to claim these grants when they should have done. I think the job retention scheme is probably more related to the size of businesses and how they can apply furlough to people when they still need people to do certain things. In rural areas, it's more self-employed scheme. I think a lot of that's to do with the nature of businesses. I mentioned before that a lot of people are employed and self-employed. They might be employed during the winter and then self-employed during the summer, for example. So I think that's out in terms of eligibility for the SEISS scheme. Also, if you've started a business within a certain time, or you've business and you are not in the self-assessment system, there are many reasons for that. But I think a key reason is that you mentioned this in line with business support. I think this has been a time when businesses more than ever before have needed one-to-one support, somebody on the end of a phone. And I think in many cases, Business Gateway and the agencies have been able to provide that. But for a lot of smaller businesses, to access that support as easily. So I think there has been quite a gap. I think part of that is sheer volume, so many businesses needing support and obviously scarce resources. But I think it's really important, for all the feedback we get from businesses is that they really welcome and the one-to-one support and the way that they can contact people really readily, because people are having real times at the moment. Their own mental health, their financial situation, everything's weighing on them. So it's been a time when the business support system has needed to be, and I think in lots of cases it has been, but I think there's been failures as well.
Stephen?
Recognise as well, in rural areas, a lot of hospitality businesses are run by families, or run by the operator themselves. So you've got to take it into consideration that there may not be the need for a lot of furlough from some of these businesses, because they're maybe run by a husband and wife team, for example, so they don't uptake for the furlough as well. But certainly the grant system will be something that a lot of people will be looking for, and business help is certainly needed. And if you take it, as I said earlier on, average business now in rural or central belt is £5,089 of a week of a loss by the time you take up furlough, as far as the payments we have to make towards furlough, pensions, national insurance, standing costs, etc. And the average grant being about £700 a week, roughly, or thereabouts. So, the grant system needs to be looked at. If Scotland wants the hospitality business still to be here next year or 2 years' time, they really need to sit down and look at this properly.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Did Graham want to come in this? No? No. So just moving on to my other point about broadband. We're in a situation where more and more businesses are moving online to try and keep their business going. And we had an announcement by the Chancellor, given that broadband is a UK responsibility, we got an announcement by the Chancellor that he's cutting the amount of money available for broadband from £5 billion to £1.2 billion over the next 4 years. And the UK government has watered down its pledge to reach every home in the country to a lower target of 85% of homes in the country. What impact will that have on the rural economy if broadband isn't funded to be rolled out across rural areas? Jackie?
It'll have a huge impact. That 15% gap will undoubtedly disproportionately affect rural areas as opposed to urban. We can only hope that the fact that the R100 scheme is still being rolled out in Scotland, and there are other complementary schemes that they will fulfil what's needed in rural Scotland. But it's absolutely critical that every area has access to high-speed broadband, and the need for high speed keeps increasing. It doesn't stay the same. The more complex and wave heavy the software and the applications need, the more we do need. We've got some really great examples in Scotland of innovation where communities have taken it on themselves to provide high-speed broadband to speed things up, and we may look at it from that perspective, help more communities to do that more quickly. I'm not advocating that everybody has to dig their own trenches, but I think if we don't, I think it's the key to Scotland's future economic success. If we don't have connectivity, we're shooting ourselves in the foot from day one. If you look at all the aspirations we have as a country, as an economy, in terms of making it a greener economy, having a well-being economy, having a more inclusive economy, having at the same time, the right kind of growth, how are we going if we can't compete with countries who have already nailed their digital connectivity? And we've already said in the session that rural, in the future of Scotland's economy, it's already making a huge contribution. I sincerely think it will make an even bigger contribution going forward, but it can only do that if it's not got the proverbial hand tied behind its back.
Anybody else want to come in on the broadband question? Liam?
Just to say, I absolutely totally agree with what Jackie has just said. Broadband connectivity for our businesses in rural areas is an absolute must. If we're wanting to promote rural entrepreneurship, we have to have connectivity to the rest of the world, and my fear is that 15% gap will be in rural areas because of the expense and whatnot. I work with young people in schools throughout Dumfries and Galloway, and particularly through the Young Enterprise programme, as well as DYW, and they're setting up their own businesses. They're not looking at physical shops, they're looking at selling their products on the internet and through social media channels that, quite frankly, I've never even heard of, and they're making a success of it. And not having access to that broadband capability will really hamper them as they move forward through life.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Stephen.
Well,
again, I agree with everything that Jackie and Graham just said there. If you look at what we talked about earlier on, people coming to settle down into rural economies from, if you like, the city side, looking at a different way of life and being able to work from home, etc., that's going to disadvantage those people in the rural areas as well from getting that if this connectivity isn't there. So I'm quite upset and annoyed that this has come forward. I think it's absolutely imperative that we get rural connectivity to the same speed as much as we can to where we get in city areas.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, we come now to questions from Maurice Golden.
Thank you for that, Convener. And I was slightly surprised at Gordon MacDonald's assertion that digital broadband is being delivered in Scotland by the UK government. I'm sure he'll be writing to the SNP on their website. It says that the SNP are improving Scotland's digital infrastructure and they have met their target. So I think there's just probably a point of clarification there that perhaps Gordon MacDonald doesn't understand what the rest of the SNP are doing in terms of delivering digital infrastructure. So hopefully that clarifies that specific point. And thanks to the UK government, almost 900,000 properties are being connected, if you believe Gordon MacDonald. On to other matters, I would wonder what the panel thought about how the rural areas in Scotland can contribute to the green recovery. I know Jackie's mentioned that previously. Jackie, would you like to start first on that?
Yes, of course, thank you. So, I think there's a myriad of ways that rural economy will contribute to the green economy. The absolutely obvious ones, obvious examples of where using our natural resources better in terms of using forestry better to create different experiences, different products, different opportunities. The way agriculture to go, which I think will support a greener economy, fingers crossed, it goes in the right direction. But I think a micro business seeing huge interest from a wide range of businesses that they just want to be greener themselves. They want to learn how to run their businesses differently so that they're contributing to carbon reduction and that they're providing things like sustainable tourism, huge interest to a lot of the tourism businesses, and because they know that will be the way to attract people in the future. I think in terms of services industries, they can contribute to a greener economy as well. And just what we've been talking about, if we have the right digital infrastructure, enable more businesses to operate and create products that can be sold online, that can be created in a more effective and efficient way, that is all contributing to the greener economy as well. And I think the overall support for a more local approach to our economy, and the recognition that people now have that they should and can, in many cases, access everything they need within 20 minutes they live, I think is really important for the future of our green economy. And a lot of our rural communities have grabbed that and created good ideas of how they can go forward with that. We've got climate change cafes to raise people's awareness. You've got little towns like Dunkeld where they've got a really dynamic local economy and are focused on helping people to shop locally and to support the local. All of that is supporting a greener way forward. So there's a myriad of opportunities, and I think the more awareness and more education, if you like, that goes and helps businesses to do really practical things, not the big things, the really practical day-to-day things. That will start to a great positive outcome.
Thank you, Jackie. Would any of the rest of the panel like to come in on the green economy? Graham, and then we'll go to Stephen.
Yeah, certainly. Again, as a region, Dumfries and Galloway, green energy is very much central to what we're producing now. We've got a long-standing history of the Galloway hydro scheme, but in more recent times, we've had the Robin Rigg offshore wind farm, and we've had a number of onshore wind farms within Dumfries and Galloway. And I think that whole industry is still there to be exploited. And we've got a number of big companies such as Natural Power, for example, based within Dumfries and Galloway, And it's interesting, when we set up an energy forum, we called it the Renewable Energy Forum, and they actually said, no, it's not, it's the Energy Forum. This is the way forward, this is the future. So I think that's there to be exploited within Dumfries and Galloway. It's often described as a natural place, you know, to live, work and learn, and we can certainly build on that, that whole green economy in relation to the smaller micro businesses that can be set up. We need digital connectivity, absolutely. But as I said already, people are realising they can set up in small rural areas and they can actually deliver a business across the world. I think tourism is definitely an area that we could still exploit in our area, in southwest Scotland. I'm always saddened by the number of people that drive up the M74 from England and don't turn left and head straight to the Highlands, when we've got some of the most fabulous coastlines and hills and forestry areas within the UK. And I know there's a kind of movement on for the creation of the Galloway National Park, which is certainly something that I would back insofar as to bring jobs and infrastructure into the more rural west of our region. I think is really, really important. I'm a very keen hill walker, and I go down to the Lake District, and frankly it's overrun. And yet I walk in the Galloway Hills and don't see another soul all day. So I do think there is areas that we can exploit to the advantage of this region.
You're quite right, Graham. Beautiful region and some of the best political representatives in the whole of Scotland in Dumfries and Galloway. Stephen, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think from hospitality, as far as that goes, you know, we've got the Northwest 500, we've got the Southwest 300, and a lot of people we try to attract now through. That's all right, Morris. I'll see you laughing. A lot of the issues we see here, we're trying to adapt to greener energy, and you know, we welcomed a lot of the grants that come out. I think there were afforded from the UK government to the Scottish government as far as electric vehicle charging points were concerned. So certainly I put one in one of my sites. And I know a lot of my colleagues have put them in the Northwest 500, and we're trying to exploit that now into the Southwest 300. So I would encourage Scottish Government to try and make some more funding available to do that. And there also is, you know, the other internal things where instead of having radiators in bedrooms, they're looking at these infrared, you know, where they actually attract the body heat of the person itself, not the room. So instead of wet heat, it's dry heat. So, you know, certainly hospitality could benefit certainly from a lot of this. And it could come from a lot of the wind farm people as well that are, you know, putting money into the community, which is great as well for local community initiatives as well. So it is a very, very well welcomed scenario for communities in the rural area.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to questions from someone from another beautiful part of Scotland, the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I have a few points to make and a few questions to ask our guests this morning. I think the first point, in response to some of Maurice Golden's crazy comments there, if the Scottish Government hadn't intervened in the broadband story for Dumfries and Galloway and the borders, we'd be waiting for another 50 years or more for the UK Government to do anything about it. That's fact. We've put our money where our mouth is to put the broadband services down there. And just having a wee quick look while that chat was going on, Convener, but 80% of the premises, all the premises down there are getting 30 megabits plus. At the minute, it's a bit of a way to go, but there's no way the UK government was delivering anything as close to that down there. I think that point has to be.
Deputy Convener, I hesitate to interrupt further chat on this point, but thank you for that. I'm just wondering if you have questions for the witnesses on further points.
Yes, I do, but I think that point had to be responded to, given what Mr. Golden said earlier.
That's fair enough.
Events is going to be.
Carry on.
One of the important events. One of the important events that's coming down the track in less than a month is called Brexit, and will be leaving the digital single market, which is worth €400 billion per year. Scotland will be taken out of that. I just wonder if the panel has a view on the impact of that on the rural community, given that we're talking about digital services and connectivity. What do the panel think might the implications of that be? Do you know that we're leaving the digital single market?
Stephen Montgomery, I think, wants to come in.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you know, we're here in Hollywood, and I'm not here to play party political football between different various political parties. But as far as Brexit is concerned, I'm here to talk about our sector. As far as Brexit is concerned, as yet, I think, given COVID is the main issue just now, we haven't really seen where Brexit is going to massively hit us, because there is an employment issue where before COVID hit, we probably would have had a shortage of skill and labour. Whereas now, when we see so many hospitality businesses actually shutting down, there may well be not as big of demand on that. However, with all the apprenticeship schemes and everything that we have seen and developing young workforce in the area, we don't see it massively as being a problem just now. But when we see next year and 18 months' time down the line, it may well be a different story.
So we're going to be leaving a digital market that's worth 400 billion euros, and that's not a problem. Jackie, what's your view on this?
Sorry, I think Graham, I'd said, could come in, and then we can come to Jackie. I think Graham had his hand up first.
Sorry, Jackie. Certainly the sector forums I've been discussing, that there is real concern on Brexit regarding the no trade agreement, and there's certainly some evidence of some of the sectors are stockpiling, whether that be machinery or materials, going forward, because they're incredibly nervous about what's going to happen in the new year. And like Stephen, I don't want to be dragged into politics, but that's certainly the feeling I'm getting from the various sector forums. Those that have got direct competitors within the EU that currently export to the EU just now, they're probably the most worried about how their business is going to be affected moving forward. And the last thing really to say is just the worry about likely disruption to logistics, particularly if they're exporting food products to the continent, and the implications of import VAT. So there's certainly concern within the sector forums. There's concern moving forward just how that's going to look, and the fact that we're still seem to be negotiating a trade deal with only 4 weeks left is real concern to businesses out there.
And Jackie wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on the digital single market issues, small businesses that are exporting small amounts of products. We have one not so far from here who's got a good market for their textile products, and it's just causing them extra hassle, stress, money, trying to work out how they're going to do that and what's going to be involved. I think for most businesses it's down to uncertainty. You know, we're sitting here we have a clear idea of what the impact's going to be. There's no deal actually on the table that's been agreed. So I think for most businesses it's only they're waiting to see what happens rather than doing a huge amount of planning. But obviously for many rural businesses, and particularly agricultural and manufacturing areas, it's going to be access to labour that's going to be the biggest issue through Brexit. And we've already got some local fruit farms in one of the best fruit growing areas of the UK, never mind Scotland. We have fruit farms that have already made decisions to stop producing of the issues that they're going to have accessing labour. So I think for many that's going to be the biggest issue, and still no sign of how they can access that much needed labour next year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, my last question, convener, if I may, just looking ahead though, trying our best to look ahead positively beyond this health emergency. The young people that took part in the panel this week with Colin Beattie and myself talked about their desire to continue to live locally. And Jackie, you mentioned it at the outset in your answer to one of your questions. They talked about the problems with transport and so on and so forth. But do you think we might be, or should be, looking at a kind of new arrangement where we both governments try to encourage employers to set up employment opportunities much more within the rural communities, rather than asking and expecting all our youngsters from places like Dumfries and Galloway to make the journey to Glasgow or Edinburgh, to the bigger cities in Scotland, to find work and employment opportunities? So should we be doing much more about that, do you think? Probably as a result of the COVID experience, but shouldn't we have been doing it anyway, do you think, for some considerable time, to try to make sure that local communities and rural communities can thrive?
I think you're right. What COVID's shone a light on is that we've possibly accepted in the past that young people have wanted to leave rural areas and go to the city. And many will for education, etc. But the surveys that have been done in the last few months have really shown that young people have a desire to stay in local areas. They want to enjoy the environment that they've been brought up in, that they live in, but they also want to develop themselves and have a that they might have if they did move. So I think what's been shown undoubtedly in the last 9 months is that it's absolutely possible to work remotely. It's absolutely possible to set up an enterprise that can sell anywhere in the world if you've got the right digital resources, and the attitude and the aspirations of young people is undoubtedly there. So why don't we make that a much more positive strategy for the future? But I've mentioned a couple of times this morning that there's infrastructural issues that could quite easily be sorted that considerably. For a young person to positively stay in a rural area, they still need access. If they can't find a job, they're going to need access to capital to create their own job. And why, when we've got schemes in place to specifically help young people, why are we not allowing them to help people to do that? Kickstart's an obvious example. Instead of having a 6-month placement with a business, make it a 6-month enterprise apprenticeship. Make that a 6-month, pay them the same to develop their idea, business plan, test trade. And at the end of the 6 months, you might well have a business at the end of it, rather than the end of a placement where they might not even have an employment opportunity.
Eve, Graham, can you offer a few comments on that possible agenda about thinking about new ways to provide employment opportunities because of the digital revolution that we're in, and the hope that we get the fastest speeds possible in the rural communities very soon? Can you see any way we should be exploiting that? Both governments should be exploiting that to assist rural communities much more.
Absolutely. It's a strange one, this, about young people wanting to leave rural areas. In Dumfries and Galloway, we did a survey a couple of years ago called the 10,000 Voices, which suggested that 55% of young people under 18 would leave Dumfries and Galloway tomorrow if they could. Thankfully, I've seen much more positive reviews more recently. SOSE ran a survey across the south of Scotland, certainly, that suggested that young people were very much keener to stay within their own localities and rural areas. And it kind of touches on a thing I would call youth-place compatibility, which is like the pattern of adjustments that lets young people experience the advantages of rural living without excessive compromise to their education and employment goals. It's about the creation of opportunities for them to carry on with their studies within a rural area, and also thereafter to seek employment. And DIW, certainly within Dumfries and Galloway, is absolutely about promoting the opportunities that are available for young people. But we are always fighting against the kind of bright lights of the cities. And I'm reminded in a wee bit of a quote from Bruce Springsteen, of all people, when he was introducing a song at a concert on My Hometown. Everybody has a love-hate relationship with their hometown. It's built into their DNA. I think that's very true. I think it comes back to that youth-place compatibility. What makes a young person want to come to Dumfries and Galloway? How do we retain our young people that we already have? And how do we attract new people into the area? So I think financial incentives to employers to create those opportunities, I think would have a massive return to a rural area, and perhaps financial incentives to young people to actually set up, because we're very good at waving off our young people to colleges and universities at 18, and they don't come back till they're 65 and retiring. How do we attract them when they're actually in that working age? And that's the big issue for us.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Graham. Stephen, can you offer any comments about how we can better exploit the digital technologies and looking ahead at different ways of providing employment, particularly for your own sector?
There's nothing really a lot I can add on to what Jackie and Graham both said there. I think, we've certainly learned throughout COVID that, businesses need to start working together more than being in competition. So if you look at self-catering compared to hotels and restaurants, for example, this is an ideal opportunity because you've seen a real boost in self-catering accommodation as we come out of the first lockdown. And now people can do really what they want to do, really, to a degree, in self-catering, where they're in their own wee bubble. But that then backs on to restaurants and cafes and things like that. They could be working together with the self-catering places to create a better environment, create more job opportunities for our youth. So I think that could be something we could be looking at.
Okay, thanks very much, all of you, for those responses. Appreciate it. Back to you, convener.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses for coming in today. The committee will now move on to item 4 of the agenda. And item 4 relates to the trade bill, which is in consideration of a proposal by the Scottish Government to consent to the UK Government legislating using the proposed powers under the trade bill once it receives royal assent. There are 2 proposed regulations. These are the Public Procurement Government Procurement Agreement regulations, which amend the procurement regulations for the UK so that they will reflect the UK's accession to the World Trade Organization Government Procurement Agreement, the GPA, in its own right, rather than in its current capacity as an EU member state. These changes will ensure that suppliers established in territories and states party to the GPA will continue to be afforded the same rights and remedies they currently have access to when participating in UK procurements after the end of the transition period. Secondly, the Public Procurement International Agreements regulations. The UK is currently attempting to negotiate the rollover of existing international agreements which the EU already has with third parties and which touch on public procurement. The UK and Scottish procurement legislation needs to be amended to reflect the UK's obligations in these rolled over EU international trade agreements. The UK government is seeking to make amendments to the Scottish procurement regulations to provide continuity as far as possible in existing trade relationships with third countries now that we have left the EU. So in conclusion, the notification of these regulations suggests that they are all Category A proposals. That is to say, technical with minimum policy choice or only one obvious policy solution. The committee previously agreed to write to the Scottish Government to seek further information on these instruments, and links to the committee's letter and the Cabinet Secretary's response are included in committee papers. Is the committee content for these matters to be dealt with by statutory instruments laid at Westminster? As the committee is content, I will write to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to notify her of the committee's decision. And I will now suspend the meeting and move into private session.